All right, shall we get to Stephen Miller?
Let's do
his latest comments. So in recent comments to reporters, Stephen Miller floated suspending habeas corpus. Really take a listen to how he lays this out here, because I think there's several significant things he says. Let's take a listen.
Well, the Constitution is clear, and that, of course, is the supreme law of the land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion. So I would say that's an option we're actively looking at. Look, a lot of it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not. At the end of the day, Congress passed a body of law known as the Immigration and Nationality Act, which stripped Article III courts, that's the judicial branch, of jurisdiction over immigration cases. So Congress actually passed, it's called jurisdiction stripping legislation. It passed a number of laws that say that the Article III courts aren't even allowed to be involved in immigration cases. Many of you probably don't know this. I'll give you a good example. Are you familiar with the term temporary protected status, or TPS, right? So by statute, the courts are stripped of jurisdiction from overruling a presidential determination or a secretarial determination on TPS when the Secretary of Homeland Security makes that determination. So when Secretary Noem terminated TPS for the illegals that Biden flew into the country, when courts stepped in, they were violating explicit language that Congress had enacted, saying they have no jurisdiction. So it's not just the courts aren't just at war with the executive branch, the courts are at war, these radical rogue judges, with the legislative branch as well too. So all of that will inform the choices the president ultimately makes, yes.
Krystal, I just want to say Stephen Miller is at war with the Trump administration there, because the Trump administration stopped the invasion.
Oh, yes, true.
It's an amazing, it's an amazing contradiction.
So are we being invaded, or are we not being invaded?
They are justifying this threat of habeas corpus on the idea that we are under invasion.
Right.
And they're also touting that they have completely shut down the southern border. So these two things are absolutely in contradiction. I was supposed to be on the new media pool duty yesterday, but they called a lid.
Yeah.
And that was like the top question that I was going to ask. Like, which one is true? Did you stop the invasion? Or can we have habeas corpus because we're being invaded?
That is a fantastic question. And I mean, the key line there, which squares the circle, so to speak, is, or what is that? Whatever.
Yeah. You got it.
You know what I'm saying.
You got it.
Anyway, is he says it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not. So also the invasion, apparently, that would justify this depends on whether or not they like the court's decisions. In terms of the last thing that he lays out there about the court stripping provisions, et cetera, you know, my reading based on other people who understand this stuff way better than I do is that he's really playing fast and loose with the facts there, and that, yes, there are court stripping provisions basically that push immigration law into immigration courts, but appeals into federal courts, as you would expect.
Yeah.
And that is the process that's been playing out in the court system that we've seen. But, you know, when you hear him say this, of course, there's a question of, all right, well, is this just Stephen Miller doing Stephen Miller stuff and, you know, trying to make a spectacle or raise some threat, but they're not really that serious about it? On the contrary, CNN at least has reporting that Trump has been directly involved in these discussions himself. We can put this up on the screen. He's been personally involved in discussions inside the administration of potentially suspending habeas corpus, legal procedure that allows people to challenge their detention in court. While Trump has not explicitly mentioned habeas corpus in public, it was what he was referencing last month when he commented on steps he could take to combat nationwide injunctions against his actions on deportations, according to one of the people familiar with the talks. And we actually have that sound of Trump sort of vaguely alluding to what Stephen Miller is laying out explicitly here. Let's go ahead and take a listen to that.
You mentioned this last night in your speech in Macomb, that we're facing an unprecedented situation where there's a lot of abuses of nationwide injunctions, sort of seemingly designed to curtail your power, specifically when it comes to deporting these illegal, violent aliens that came in under the previous administration. Yeah. Have you spoken to your team about ways to mitigate this and continue to deliver for the American people?
Well, there are ways to mitigate it, and there's some very strong ways. There's one way that's been used by 3 very highly respected presidents, but we hope we don't have to go that route. But there is one way that has been used very successfully by 3 presidents, all highly respected, and hopefully we don't have to go that way. But there are ways of mitigating that.
So I believe, Emily, the 3 presidents he's referring to are Abraham Lincoln, most famously, I would say, Grant during Reconstruction to try to get the violence of the KKK under control, and then George W. Bush wouldn't necessarily say I highly respected that one during the
But they're
war.
also taking the Iraq war plans.
That's true. So I guess we're rehabbing George W. Bush with this administration. But yeah, so during the war on terror, and effectively, look, what they want to be able to do is say whoever they want to designate as, quote unquote terrorist, whether that's a cartel association or a tattoo or just because they say so, or perhaps someone who harbors ill will against a Tesla or who said the wrong thing with regard to Palestine or Israel, or who dared to protest in a hands-off protest or something like that against the Trump administration. I'm not making these examples up, by the way. These are all groups that have been floated as domestic terrorists by the Trump administration officials, that they can just snatch them up and imprison them indefinitely without them being able to challenge that imprisonment as unlawful. That's what they are contemplating here. And I think most immediately they're contemplating it in the context of of immigration, and obviously their plan to use the Alien Enemies Act to effectively get around any sort of court challenges and just ship people into these foreign gulags where they've never been heard, where they can never be heard from again. That has been in large part blocked by the courts. They're very unhappy with the court decisions. And so now this is the next path to try to effectuate this same lawless outcome via, a different legal patina that they're going for.
Yeah. And I think some of this is Stephen Miller trying to ratchet up pressure on judges. I think, of course, whenever you see Trump or top officials, someone as powerful as Stephen Miller, flirting with this stuff in public, you have to absolutely take it seriously. If I had to guess, I would say that Stephen Miller's strategy here is ratcheting up pressure on judges, and that he is not entirely serious about doing this because of what we were mentioning earlier, just that it would make it it would make it appear as though there's an ongoing invasion during the Trump administration, which is going to become an increasing problem for their immigration crackdown period. As you mentioned, that's what they're justifying some of these deportations with, the idea that there's an invasion that is being orchestrated by the Venezuelan government through Tren de Aragua, which even, I think John Hudson had this in the Washington Post, even the Trump administration's own intelligence undermines, says it's not being orchestrated by the government of Venezuela. So,
and a Trump appointed judge said the same. Said effectively, like, this is a preposterous invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. It fails on every level.
Yeah. Yep. The last thing I wanted to say on this is I think it is fair to point out that there have been some real abuses of the universal injunctions. And there's been, at executive functions, Jack Landman Goldsmith has been following this in a really interesting way, and a way that's very critical of Donald Trump. And basically, we were talking about this in our earlier corruption block. Mm-hmm. In general, there has been just a lot of norm sliding since 2016, as everyone kind of knows, or maybe backsliding. Norm backsliding is one way to put it. And it is true that some of this, so for example, administrative stays. He writes, the practice of administrative stays against executive action, according to Christopher Moore, was basically unheard of before 2022. And he says that the Trump administration arguments against single federal judges enjoining programs on a universal basis are entirely legitimate, meaning there have been a lot of cases in this second Trump administration where judges are acting alone on a national basis with these universal injunctions in ways that are inappropriate. That said, obviously he goes on to say some of this is because the Trump administration itself is taking some unprecedented steps. So I think we're in one of those situations where it's like the answer to Trump's craziness might also be crazy. It's just sort of a question of how do you get out of the doom spiral, and that's pretty that feels. I guess I feel very pessimistic about that, Krystal.
I do as well, Emily. I do as well. Yeah, it reminds me of, one of the talking points that Trump administration officials and defenders like to say is like, no presidential administration has faced more lawsuits. It's like, well, yeah, because they haven't done as much illegal shit just like wildly in less, in 100 days or less as you all have. So there's a logical reason why you're facing so much trouble with the courts. And it's on immigration. It's on a lot of the DOJ activity has been enjoined and, ultimately will likely be struck down. You can see that there has been, with this administration, I think, and intentionally, you talked about this as well, they just decided they don't really care about the law. They're going to do what they want to do and then let the courts have to clean up the mess.
Exactly.
And so then when the courts come in and are like, you can't do that, And, you can't just shut down the CFPB. You can't just shut down USAID. You can't just decide that you don't like this program, so you're not going to spend the money that was congressionally appropriated. You can't just ship people to a foreign gulag, no due process. You can't admit that you wrongfully deported this person and then be like, we're not going to do anything about it, though. When they come in to clean up the mess, you don't get to kick and scream about it because your whole plan was we're going to break a lot of laws and then force the courts to have to come in and clean up the mess afterwards. So, I think that is a kind of ratcheting up that is that they, I'm sure, anticipated was going to come as a result here. And so I think the significance of the Miller comments, I think you have to take these things very seriously at this point because of the way the Trump administration has conducted themselves. And clearly they do have a goal of getting around normal due process and normal checks that have existed, in this country since the founding and, going back to the, Magna Carta in terms of legal principles and aspirations.
Krystal's just pulling out all
state.
of the documents.
Let me get out my pocket Magna Carta here.
You should sell Breaking Point's branded pocket Magna. Oh gosh, Sagar would love that. We shouldn't even speak it into existence because
It'll be our baby gift to him.
He would love that. By the way, if you're not following executive functions, shout out to them. They're pretty Trump critical, but I do find them pretty helpful. And just one more point from Goldsmith, who writes, he's argued the administration has a legitimate complaint about universal injunctions and administrative stays that should ultimately be resolved by a Supreme Court or Congress. There is a pattern of mostly Democrat-appointed district judges enjoining Trump initiatives, just as there was a similar and indeed more extreme in terms of percentages mirrored pattern during the Biden years. But to know whether the 2025 pattern reflects real or systemic bias, we would need to assess a whole slew of issues. And this is, I'm just going to list this out so that we know what to keep our eye on going forward. The influence of plaintiff forum shopping, the profile of judges who denied relief, and the abundant evidence that Trump 2.0 is not taking legal compliance seriously. So those are the things to follow, I think, going forward in this broader narrative of the universal injunctions and the stays.
Yeah, because, I mean, some things, their extraordinary actions have required extraordinary actions as well. And even so, the courts can't really keep up, aren't really a match for, and the Trump administration to that point has just in many instances said, we got this ruling against us. We're still not really going to comply. We'll do a little bit, or we'll pay some lip service, or we'll sort of pretend that that we read it a different way, et cetera. But, in many and many of them, not the high profile like Kilmar Abrego Garcia, but some of the decisions that have gone against DOJ, for example, where they say, okay, you have to reinstate this funding, and then they just don't.
Well, yeah, and you're right. You mentioned this just really quickly as we wrap up. That's part of the strategy here, is to throw as many novel legal theories at the wall and see what sticks. That's very much the Alien Enemies Act. A lot of people in Trump circles would say, listen, what we're doing is taking this action while it works its way through the courts. And if the courts go one way, Trump has said this many times, we'll follow the courts. And that's because as dangerous as it is to even toe that line, the reason they're doing that is so that they can get as much done as quickly as possible. So it's not just a messaging flood the zone strategy vis-a-vis Bannon, but it's actually just about trying as many different strategies as they can to get things done while the courts go through the process. Otherwise, they feel like they won't have enough time to take as many dramatic actions. DOJ is a really good example of this, just folding the CFPB, for example. Well, it's basically done. That's already happened.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's under, they've kind of truncated it and moved it, and to formally close it have to go through Congress. But now the Overton window has just been exploded. So when the CFPB, if it goes to the reconciliation bill, if they're getting rid of it, it's less of a fight because we've gone through 5 months now without the CFPB.
Creative facts on the ground.
Yep.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Just really quick, I wanted to get this in the show because this is just wild. Put this up on the screen. So Trump has by and large suspended refugee resettlement with one very specific example, which is white South Africans are not only being granted refugee status by Trump, but they're also being given, funds and plane tickets and all sorts of assistance to relocate here. So, this is a Elon Musk, Stephen Miller project, if you've ever seen one. So, the refugees fleeing wars and persecution from any other place around the world, nope, even ones who had been, absolutely vetted, people in Afghanistan, for example, who had helped our own troops during the war there at grave risk to themselves. And now you've got the Taliban back in power. Their refugee resettlement applications being torn up, even though they're vetted, ready to go. That's not happening. But white South Africans, they're being, given the green light and the red carpet rolled out for them to come here.
Yeah, and part of the reason is that the Trump administration feels as though this is a really clear-cut contrast with some of the BS asylum claims. And it's not that they aren't sympathetic stories, but they are economic cases that people have claimed asylum, come up to the United States borders, claimed asylum. And in some cases, I think this was probably true with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, but who knows? We actually asked his attorney about this a month or two ago, about the legitimacy of his asylum claim that he made in 2019. So the administration feels like they have a perfect juxtaposition here of people who, in South Africa, it is a deeply uncomfortable thing to think about or talk about or explore. There is still high levels of racial violence, and that's where they think they have this clear-cut case, and they're trolling with this because Tucker did an interesting interview actually a couple months back with a South African civil rights activist. His name is Ernst Retz, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Tucker asked him about this, and he was like, South Africans, they don't want to leave. So that's why I think this is a troll from the administration to say, here's what a real asylum case looks like versus here's what the economic migrant asylum case looks like. And South Africans are fighting for a reason. It's because they don't, their family settled that land hundreds of years ago, if you listen to their point on it. So they feel like it would be the opposite of what they want to do, to flee to the United States. Mm-hmm. So it's just a troll, basically.
Yeah. Okay. So the numbers are that white South Africans make up roughly 7% of the South African population and own roughly 73% of the individually held land.
Yeah.
And their claim is that they are the victims of such egregious racial discrimination that their claims should go beyond those of, like I said, the interpreters who work for us in Afghanistan or people who are fleeing Democratic Republic of Congo or Sudan.
Venezuela or Cuba.
Correct. Yeah, that's right. Which Republicans 5 seconds ago would have had a very different take on that view. And so all refugee resettlement shut down except for this group of white South Africans who Steve Bannon says are the most racist people on the planet. According to Steve Bannon, just quoting him.
just quoting Steve.
Yes. So anyway, that Stephen Miller project is ongoing. One more piece here, which is, some of this is breaking through with the public in terms of their views of Trump. We can put this up on the screen. This was a poll that was taken in the context of Trump's first 100 days that we didn't get a chance to cover, but I wanted to, make sure to highlight here. You have a majority of Americans now, 52%, who say that Trump is a dangerous dictator, whose power should be limited before he destroys American democracy. That was the question here. And I think this was commissioned by Axios. So 52% of all Americans, 87% of Democrats, 56% of independents, and even 17% of Republicans, which is actually a little bit higher than I would have expected. Along racial lines, there's some racial divide here. The highest numbers are among Black Americans, 67%, then Latino, 63%, Asian Americans, Pacific Islander, 58%, and white Americans, 45%. So even among white people, you're getting pretty close to a majority who say this guy is a dangerous dictator. And what I've been saying, Emily, is I think as his popularity declines, I think you will see more and more aggressive authoritarian tactics to shut down dissent. Now, I think what we're seeing this week, and this is we see this throughout our show, you've got the China quote unquote deal, you've got whatever's going on in Gaza, you've got the prescription drug thing we're about to talk about. I get the sense he realizes that his popularity is plummeting and he needs to do some stuff, make some announcements, make some things happen, get some good PR, get some good headlines to try to stem the tide in terms of his plummeting approval rating. But in any case, even as people, of course, have responded, typically respond most to their own direct material interests, people are also, in America, pretty opposed to dictators who threaten democracy. We're at least theoretically, ideally, committed to having a democratic system here. It's something that people take a lot of pride in this country. And so I do think because his actions have been so extraordinary, so authoritarian, and so rapid, that the flip side of the, what is Bannon called the Days of Thunder, the flood the zone strategy of doing so much at one time, you don't get to have that boiling frog effect where it's just ratcheting. This hit people over the head. And, you know, I think there's a genuine, deep concern among a lot of people about the direction that he's taking the country in.
Well, yeah, and so this poll was February to March, and it was by the Public Religion Research Institute. It was part of this like gargantuan poll. It's a very interesting poll, actually, if you read all of it. And I mean, that's why I kind of thought the Bukele stuff was just playing with fire for the Trump administration. Like, I think they had this idea that the Bukele stuff made them look cool. And I think to most Americans, it's like, there's nothing cool about Bukele. Like, he's so sad. Like, it's such a ridiculous thing that he's doing. Like, calling himself a cool dictator. Maybe it flies in Latin America. It does not fly in the United States. Like, it doesn't hit the same way here. Now, the poll juxtaposed that question that you just read with, so dangerous dictator, also that he's a strong leader restoring America's greatness was the other option, that he's a strong leader who should be given the power he needs to restore America's greatness. And then I think there was like a skip option. So it was 52 to 44 in that question. Interestingly, in that poll, he had a 43% approval rating, which means that there's probably some overlap of people who approve of the job he's doing and also see him as a dangerous dictator.
Well, that's why I was noting the Republican numbers, 17% saying he's a dangerous dictator. I'm sure he probably, you know, his Republican approval rating is probably 90%.
It's probably pretty high.
So there's probably, you know, some percentage in there that are like, yeah, he's a dictator, but you do what you got to do.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah, well, I mean, that unfortunately is what we've learned throughout history is when democracy is unable to deliver benefits. Yeah. Then guess what? People start to become dictator curious, and I do think that's where we are.
It feels like desperate times, and I mean, if we don't even talk about this enough, nobody talks about this enough, how useless Congress has become, just utterly useless. This is, even if if you were a Republican right now, you're looking at Republicans holding the presidency, the House, and the Senate, and all they can do is muster a reconciliation bill, because they're not confident in their numbers. There's no way for them to build consensus to pass major pieces of legislation. They have punted so much of their responsibilities to administrative agencies and to the president himself. I mean, just to try to take back tariff power, they couldn't even get that passed. In part because a Democrat was like traveling overseas and didn't even care enough about the freaking vote. So Congress is just, it's a really dangerous situation, how atrophied the political process of like Republican government is.
Although to be honest with you, I don't know that that is really necessary. Like we've talked about this in the context of immigration. This will be a good transition to the prescription drug piece.
Yes.
Democrats were ready to capitulate on all kinds of immigration things. Like if they had wanted to work through a congressional process to accomplish something, especially in the very early days of Trump's term, they certainly could have done it. You know, I think it's just easier to put out an executive order. Then he doesn't have to negotiate. He can just be a king. He can just issue his proclamations and then, you know, kick it to the courts and make the courts stop him. And so I think he just prefers that to the messiness of having to get in the weeds or, God forbid, work with some Democrats on something that he would want to get done.
And they don't want to take votes. I mean, Congress doesn't want to take votes. They don't want to be held accountable when it's easier to go through the president. So it's better for everyone.
It's mutually reinforcing. Yeah, because they don't have to take any tough votes.
Yep.
And he can just do whatever he wants.
Right. Trade wars, actual wars, all of that. I mean, we're just completely, like Biden kept the Trump tariffs and that didn't go through Congress. Same thing with like, we've had an AUMF for however long that bipartisan presidents have used.
2003 or whatever.
Yeah, it is mutually reinforcing.
Yeah.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.